Thanks for joining today's webinar, which is going to be a little bit of a crash course on soil carbon. I'm Kelsey Regina. I'm a project manager with the Wallace Center who's hosting this webinar today. To start us off, I'm first going to go over some logistics for the webinar. I'll talk briefly about the Wallace Center and Pasture Project. Then we'll get into our presentation, and then we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes for your questions at the end. In terms of Zoom technology, we're all pretty familiar with it at this point, but we do ask that you keep yourselves muted during the presentation, but you should feel free to put questions in the chat box as you have them. We will have time at the end of the presentation to address them, but feel free to put them in the chat box as you have them so you don't lose track of your questions. We'll keep track of them for you. If you're having any technical difficulties, you can also feel free to put those questions in the chat box, and we'll do what we can to help you out. Sometimes it's just leaving and then re-entering the Zoom call that fixes it. There will be a short survey that follows up right after this webinar. It's 4 questions, and it's really just to help us develop future webinars, how this one go, other ideas for topics that y'all might have. And this webinar is being recorded, and it will be available on the Pasture Project YouTube channel in the coming weeks, so keep an eye out for that. All right, let's do some introductions. So Wallace Center works nationally to bring together diverse people and ideas to co-create solutions that build healthy farms, equitable economies, and resilient food systems. Our vision is that all communities have power to nourish themselves and regenerate ecosystems through just food and agricultural systems. At the heart of these systems are dynamic networks of people connected through interdependent relationships with each other and the land. The Pasture Project is an initiative of the Wallace Center that works to advance and integrate regenerative grazing as a scalable, market-driven solution for building healthy soil, viable farms, and resilient communities in the upper Midwest, and specifically in a 6-state region in the upper Mississippi River Basin, although we do work with some national audiences. The Pasture Project provides farmers, graziers, land managers, and others with a data-backed case for economic, environmental, and social benefits of implementing regenerative grazing. We continue to build a strong alliance of partners for supporting regenerative grazing and other regenerative management practices across the upper Mississippi River Basin. We host webinars like this one as part of our education and outreach efforts to promote regenerative grazing. If you'd like to learn more, you can visit pastureproject.org or more about other initiatives at the Wallace Center. Feel free to visit wallacecenter.org. All right, on to our presenter. Dr. Gregg Sanford is a senior scientist in the Department of Plant and Agroecosystem Sciences at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. As an agroecologist, his research efforts are focused on diverse agricultural landscapes and the impact that long-term management choices in such landscapes have on metrics of system performance, such as productivity, profitability, and ecosystem services. Much of Dr. Sanford's research is directed towards the role of agroecosystems can play in climate change adaptation by building stable and resilient agricultural landscapes, as well as the important role such landscapes have in mitigating rising levels of man-made greenhouse gases via the stabilization and accrual of organic carbon in soils. So thank you, Gregg, for presenting today. We really are lucky to have your expertise, and I will kick it off to you.
Thank you very much. Give me just 1 second here to share my screen. Let's see if I can actually do this. Okay, can everybody see this?
Yep, looks great.
Great. Try and hide these buttons quick. Hide floating meeting controls. Great. Well, thank you all very much. I assume that this topic, Soil Carbon 101, is something we've all heard about, and there are probably things we know about it, probably things we're still curious about, and I hope that the presentation today helps clarify some of those questions and curiosities without being too redundant in terms of things you might already know. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the importance of soil carbon, how we measure soil carbon, and kind of where some of the misunderstandings associated with soil carbon are coming from. I want to start off maybe with the importance and One of the reasons that carbon is important is because it's one of the largest pools. I'm sorry, soil carbon is important is because it's one of the largest pools of carbon in the world. So if we look at a schema like this, which covers the different kind of major pools of carbon on Earth, we have the carbon pool in the ocean, which is the largest carbon pool, followed by a fossil carbon pool, which is carbon that's locked in rock or fossil sediments, which we can affect. This is kind of where we get our fuel from. But if we look at the soils are our third largest pool. And those are, 3 times bigger, or the pool is 3 times bigger than the atmospheric carbon pool, and almost 5 times bigger than all of the carbon trapped in trees and plants and animals. So it's a large pool, and how we manage our soils can impact the size of that pool. And so given the size of it, even small changes in that pool size could have meaningful and profound effects in terms of atmospheric carbon, which could then drive climate change through the production of greenhouse gases. So in terms of managing our soil pool, we really have land management, what we're planting, and then soil management. Are we tilling? Are we not tilling? What are we doing? But there's, of course, a lot of things that are out of our control. Photosynthesis, plant respiration, et cetera. Which gets me to kind of the very fundamental question of how do we build soil carbon? And soil carbon really starts with photosynthesis in the sun. We have what we call net primary production, which is the accumulation of carbon in plant biomass through photosynthesis. Plants take up CO2 from the atmosphere using water and sunlight, energy from sunlight, and they produce their leaves, their stems, their shoots, their fruit, etc. And over time, whether that plant's aging or we're going through a season and it's being harvested, some amount of those plant residues make their way into the soil system. And they make their way into the soil system really as detritus, which is just kind of raw plant carbon. It's carbon that we would consider unprotected. Now, some of that raw detritus makes it into kind of protected soil pools of carbon, either because it's biochemically complex, things like lignin might be harder to break down, or because it's physically protected in soil structure. But the vast majority of carbon that persists in the soil is carbon that has first gone through the digestive tract, if you will, of soil microbes. So this is microbially processed carbon. And we do know from now a pretty large body of literature that most of the old carbon in our soils is carbon that once was microbial, we call it microbial necromass, basically dead microbes. So that microbial processing is a real key piece in kind of the soil carbon building or soil carbon dynamic process. And those microbes, of course, as they're eating carbon, are also expending energy to make use of that carbon to build their biomass. And as they do that, they respire carbon dioxide. And we call this heterotrophic respiration. That's the carbon dioxide that comes off the soil due to microbial decomposition of organic matter. And when we get to what is carbon sequestration, then, and I'm going to skip ahead real quick, it's really the kind of mass balance between the carbon that comes in here, this NPP, and the carbon that's respired by microbes, this heterotrophic respiration. That, if the green arrow is bigger than the red arrow, carbon accumulates. If the red arrow is bigger than the green arrow, carbon slowly declines. And while this is kind of the main process, there are several things that can manipulate or moderate that process. Things like climate, how wet and how warm is a field or environment. What about the litter quality and quantity? Are we putting a lot of litter in? And is it really low carbon to nitrogen litter like alfalfa? Or is it really high carbon to nitrogen litter like corn? Are we tilling that soil or not? And then, of course, certain factors that we call edaphic factors or soil factors, things like texture, mineralogy, the nutrient composition of the soil. So The basic balance, kind of carbon in, carbon out, is pretty straightforward. But when we start talking about microbes and soil factors and climate, things start to get pretty complex. Great. How do we measure carbon? Well, we're not going to actually talk much about this. I just want you to know that the vast majority of scientists analyzing total carbon are going to rely on something called a dry combustion analyzer. This would be kind of the gold standard, if you will, for carbon analysis. It looks like this picture up in the right-hand corner, just a little gray box with some buttons. But what you essentially do is you take your soil sample and you wrap it in foil, and that tin soil sample is dropped into a incredibly hot incineration furnace. And that furnace combusts the sample. The sample then goes through a column where it's oxidized, and then through a column where it's reduced, and then through a column where any water in the sample is removed. There's an H2O trap. And then it goes through this squiggly bit that's called a GC column. And what that does is it kind of slows down bigger molecules and allows faster molecules to pass through quicker. So nitrogen, the nitrogen in the sample passes through this coil quicker than the carbon dioxide. And when nitrogen hits this thermal conductivity detector, it has a specific thermal conductivity, and the computer can pick up that thermal conductivity. And then when the CO2 comes through, it can pick up the thermal conductivity of the CO2. And we basically use the carbon dioxide generated from combustion of this sample to estimate how much total carbon was in that sample. Again, it's a pretty straightforward process. This is the gold standard, and it's a different process than many of you would see if you sent a soil sample in for nutrient analysis and got organic matter back. That's a different assessment of kind of the carbon in a soil, because it includes more than carbon, and it's far less accurate, but a perfectly good measure for kind of on-farm management. Great. So what can we do in terms of managing our soils for carbon? I'm sure that if we were doing a question answer right now, you all would have a number of examples of things you've heard or experienced on your own farm. But generally, there's a suite of acceptable or accepted practices. One of them is fertilization, this idea that if we add more nitrogen, we can build more carbon, which means more carbon is going into the soil. No-till has been proposed as a way to build carbon because tillage tends to cause carbon loss and soil structure breakdown. Cover crops, super popular right now. This idea that rather than having bare soils, we've got crops growing in those times of the year when we don't have, or we've got plants growing during those times of year when we don't have crops that can contribute to carbon. Biochar, which is really a pyrolysis product, but a stable source of carbon. Biodiversity, this idea that the more plant species we have, the more likely we are to build carbon because we have some complementarity. This, ties into cover crops with this, interest in multi-species mixes. And then perennials, which not surprisingly combine many of the things we've seen above, this idea of keeping the soil covered, reducing tillage, increasing biodiversity, et cetera. And along with that, this reintegration of crops and livestock, if it's possible, and that could be, actually switching into a livestock system where you're rotational grazing as opposed to growing grain crops, like a whole system switch, or it could be things like grazing cover crops, or even incorporating manure from nearby dairies or livestock operations into your rotations. The interesting thing, however, is that even all of these things are promoted, if you look through the scientific literature, there are examples of them working. There are examples of them not working. It's pretty classical, well, it depends type of thing in science, which can be really frustrating for producers and those of us trying to make sense of carbon in soils. But a big part of that kind of discrepancy, yes, it's working, no, it's not working, have to do with the way that we evaluate the impact of these practices on carbon. And so I just want to talk briefly about some methods. We're going to get a little bit into the weeds, but my hope is that by kind of understanding some of the methods at play, we can see why we're seeing some of these discrepancies. So one of the methods we need to talk about is kind of this use of equivalent soil mass to evaluate carbon between two systems. The other one is soil depth. Are we just sampling the top 6 inches, top 12 inches, or are we sampling the entire soil horizon? And then do we actually have samples where we're seeing carbon change over time, or are we actually comparing one practice to another practice? There's a difference in kind of the way that we can interpret results from those types of analyses. So let's first talk about time, measuring carbon accrual in time. If you'll bear with me, this is just kind of a mock-up figure to help explain a phenomenon here. On the vertical axis, we have soil organic carbon content in metric tons per hectare. You can think of it as tons of carbon per acre. And on the horizontal axis, we have years. You can see it goes from 0 to 50. And the dotted line is supposed to represent kind of carbon change over time, regardless of management, just kind of background change. Maybe it's changing because of climate. Maybe it's changing because of, way back over here at year 0, it was a prairie or a forest and we tilled it up. But regardless, it's changing over time. And then each one of these scenarios are identical. They show a 5 metric ton per hectare difference between an improved management, those are the yellow dots, and a conventional management, those are the blue dots. So scenario A, scenario B, scenario C, all the same in terms of the change between these two dots. But if we just walk into a scenario, for example, you convert to cover crops and you have cover crops going for 10 years and you come in at 10 years and you look at scenario A and you compare your improved management to conventional management, you might say, well, look, I have 5 tons of carbon per hectare more than I used to, and so I've sequestered carbon. But you'll notice that because carbon is changing in the background, both of the scenarios in A represent a net loss of carbon. The improved management only lost 1.9 tons, while the kind of conventional managed lost 2.9 tons, but there's still losses. And so kind of where a system begins, that baseline carbon measurement is critical. So we take our baseline measures and what we see is that in scenario A, both of them result in carbon loss. In scenario B, we have stable carbon with our improved management, but loss in our conventional management. And then in scenario C, we see that we have carbon accruing in our improved management, but staying stable in our conventional management. So it's really important that we do actually have time series of carbon measurements to get an accurate understanding of sequestration or carbon loss. Comparing any two systems to one another is important, but it doesn't actually tell us much about carbon sequestration. In terms of measuring soil at depth, equally as important, here we have some data from the Wisconsin Integrated Cropping Systems trial in South Central Wisconsin, looking at pasture, forage systems, and grain systems. This is change in carbon, again, tons per hectare over a 20-year period. And this middle line means no change. If these little whiskers cross the line, it's not significantly different. If they're above or below, we have a gain or a loss. So in this case, in the top 6 centimeters, that's 0 to 15, top 6 inches, 0 to 15 centimeters, our pastures are gaining carbon, our forage systems are not changing, and our grain systems are losing carbon. If, however, we look at the entire soil depth, which in this case is 90 centimeters or about 3 feet, we see a different picture. We actually see that pastures are not changing and that both our forage and grain systems are losing carbon. And, what's happening here is that, whatever gains or accumulation is occurring in those surface 6 inches, those are being offset by losses at depth. And so if we just look at the top 15 centimeters, or maybe what's more common, looking at the top 30 centimeters without investigating deeper horizons, we start to run into interpretation issues, and we start missing part of the story. Now, most changes do happen in those top soils, but changes at depth are significantly impactful in certain scenarios. And the reason this is important is because most of our carbon markets that are coming online require or mandate monitoring in that top 30 centimeters, but don't require monitoring deeper. The International Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, similarly has kind of the standard of a 30 centimeter depth without encouraging or pressing for deeper carbon assessments. The final one is kind of correcting for soil mass. So here again, a thought experiment. We have a soil core on the left. Let's say it's a 10 centimeter deep soil core. The soil core weighs 100 grams. Each of these red dots equals 1 gram, or brown dots on your screen equals 1 gram of soil organic carbon, and each one of the yellow dots is a gram of mineral soil. And so in this left figure, we have 2 grams of carbon per centimeter squared. So you could blow that up to an acre if you wanted, but this tells you kind of how much carbon you have per area of land. Well, we know, any of us who have been out in the field after chopping silage or harvesting alfalfa, we know that equipment can compact the soil. We also know that as we grow more and more cover crops or increase more and more residues, the soil can actually get lighter and less compacted. And that has a big impact on how we measure carbon. So, here we took a 10 centimeter soil core and we made it down 10 centimeters in this original horizon. But let's say we compact that soil and come back to this compacted soil where the upper surface is been compacted, and we pull a 10-meter core. In this case, that 10-meter core is sampling 10 centimeter core. That 10 centimeter core is sampling 8 centimeters of the original sample, and then an additional 2 centimeters below the original sample, because we're sampling by depth, and now this soil has been compacted. And as a result, we end up with actually 120 grams of soil in this second sampling and 2.4 grams of carbon per square centimeter. Now, if I didn't take into account the fact that my soils had compacted, I'd say, well, look at that. We've sequestered carbon. We've built our carbon. We have 2.4 grams of carbon per centimeter squared. We started off with 2 grams of carbon per centimeter squared. Things are looking good. So the problem is that, we're going to keep sampling by depth because it's the easiest way for us to do it, but we need to account for any changes in bulk density so that we can correct our carbon sequestration estimates to reflect accurately those kind of physical changes in the soil. And we call this kind of equivalent soil mass corrections. We basically, we'd either tack on a little bit of soil to the original measurement or shave a little soil off the end measurement, so that when we're comparing, sample 1 to sample 2, we're comparing apples to apples. So what does this look like in real life? This is 30-year carbon data from the Wisconsin Integrated Cropping Systems Trial. It's busy. There's a lot. I apologize. I just want to kind of show you how these different methods can change the interpretation of what we're seeing. So in this first figure, we have that 0 to 6 inch horizon, 0 to 15 centimeters, very similar to that last figure from Wixt. We have change in carbon in tons of carbon per hectare per year. And this dotted line means no change. Above that dotted line, if the whiskers don't intersect, we're accumulating carbon. Below the dotted line, we're losing carbon. And up in the right-hand corner, if you're curious, are the individual systems. The bottom line is that the first 3 systems on the left of each of those panels are cash grain systems. And then we have 2 forage systems, that's the green and the yellow. And then we have a pasture, which is the blue, and a restored prairie, which is the orange. So If we look at this and we do a comprehensive analysis, that is, we account for changes in bulk density, we sample over time, this full 30 years. In that first 15 centimeters, we see that we've accumulated carbon in our grassland systems, that prairie and pasture, but we've lost it in our two kind of more conventional grain systems, our corn and our no-till corn soybean. If, however, we don't account for changes in bulk density, that's this middle panel, we see that our organic grain and our pasture have accumulated carbon, but all of the other systems have remained the same. And then if we kind of walk into those plots at year 30 and don't take into account any of the historical data, that is not where those systems started, but just where they are now, we would say, well, the pasture has lost, or the pasture has gained carbon. All of the grain systems have lost carbon. The forage systems haven't changed. So you can see, like, the interpretations aren't giant differences, but they're big enough differences that you would walk away with a different take-home message about what practices are going to lead to carbon accumulation or not. Okay, well, one of the other things we talked about as being an important kind of methodological consideration is depth. And so this is the same setup, but here we're looking at that entire 90 centimeters. And what you can see is, with a comprehensive analysis, we find that all of our field crops, regardless of whether they're forage systems or grain systems, regardless of whether they have cover crops or manure, at this experiment have lost carbon, where our grassland systems have stabilized carbon. And this is true both in our comprehensive analysis and when we don't account for bulk density. So in this case, that kind of accounting for bulk density didn't matter. But using space for time does change the story. If we use space for time, this idea of kind of ignoring the historical data, but just walking in after 30 years and comparing the different treatments, we see that pasture will have gained carbon, but our grain systems, some of our grain systems would have lost carbon. Okay, so you're either tracking with me or you've kind of glazed over and you're wondering who cares. The case that I want to try and make here, which gets back to why we see that some of these practices work in some situations and not in other situations, come down to the fact that this linear depth method that is not correcting for bulk density, and the use of space for time even more so, are methods that are really very common in the scientific literature. They've only recently begun to start shifting and accounting for these important nuances of measurement. And as a result, a lot of the scientific literature that many of our assumptions about carbon sequestration are built off of have some significant gaps or caveats in interpretation that aren't really making it all the way through to the end user, which is you and me trying to understand carbon credit markets. The end user is also the private companies building these carbon markets. So there are important implications kind of associated with this background methods employed in assessing carbon. Obviously, I would advocate that we need to be looking at and understanding carbon from a comprehensive standpoint, and that any federal or private effort to monetize carbon credits need to be basing their assumptions and estimates on these comprehensive methods. Okay, so enough said about methods. I want to talk about, what are realistic carbon sequestration rates, because you'll hear people kind of all over the place throwing out numbers. Some of them are pretty fantastic numbers in terms of what can be accomplished and how quickly. So I want to take two examples. One of them is from here in South Central Wisconsin. Again, the Wisconsin Integrated Cropping Systems Trial. These are on prairie soils, which scientists call mollisols. And I want to compare that to data from colleagues in Michigan and South Central Michigan, also from a long-term experiment. But those are on forest soils or alpha soils, so very different soils. The soils in Wisconsin are finer textured, that is, they're more silty. The soils in Michigan are more sandy loam. So different historical vegetation, prairie and forest, and then different texture. So here, looking at the Wisconsin Integrated Cropping Systems trial, this figure will look familiar to the figure we looked at earlier. It's just that I've tilted it on its end. So in this case, the change in carbon per hectare is on the horizontal axis, and the systems are on the vertical axis. And we see that over the course of 20 years, these bottom three systems, those grains had lost carbon to a depth of 90 centimeters. The forages had lost carbon to a depth of 90 centimeters. And the pasture had kind of stabilized carbon. Similarly, Conservation Reserve Program and prairie at the same site after just 10 years had kind of stabilized carbon. We weren't seeing significant differences. And so from Wisconsin, we end up with a carbon sequestration rate of negative 1.5 to about 0 metric tons of carbon per hectare. So kind of floating around 0 or a little bit less than 0. So we're losing carbon in these soils. Michigan, we have a very similar suite of systems. Here we've got, the use of no-till in a grain system, reduced input in a grain system. In this grain system, just for your edification, is corn, soy, wheat. We then have a biologically based grain system, which is essentially organic corn, soy, wheat. And then we have an alfalfa system. Again, the horizontal axis here is that change in carbon, and the vertical axis are those systems based on color. And here this is a 25-year data series. And in this case, you can see, again, different soils, different texture soils, different historical vegetation. We're seeing carbon accumulating in all of these systems. And if we look at kind of the average or the range in carbon sequestration rates, we're looking at 0.2 to 0.7 metric tons of carbon per hectare per year. So if we step back, it seems reasonable to expect kind of plus or minus half a ton of carbon per hectare per year. So these are metric tons of carbon per hectare per year. That's about a quarter kind of short ton or American ton of carbon per acre per year. So 0.25 tons per acre per year. That's a really robust number that I think would be realistic. Certainly you're going to get those cases where you've got a change in 1 metric ton per hectare per year, plus or minus. But when you start hearing people throwing out things like 3 or 4 tons of carbon per acre per year, I think you should step back, maybe ask some more questions and think about where those data are coming from, and maybe consider some of the methods they use to obtain the data. Again, just showing you, this is where that Wisconsin data came from, the red point. These green shaded areas are the prairie soils, and Michigan over here was in forest soils. It's actually not shaded on this map. What I think is really important about that is if you kind of like step back to 30,000 feet, again, Wisconsin is kind of what we call this prairie peninsula, where the prairie is kind of stuck east a little bit into our ag land, whereas they didn't make it quite to Michigan in large stretches by any means. If we look at the kind of historical extent of the tall grass prairie, we can see that it stretched all over the greens in particular, I'm thinking of, and the oranges. Illinois, Iowa, southern Minnesota, the Dakotas, Nebraska, etc., Kansas. And if we were to take this and overlay where our really intensive corn and soybean production acres are, that quote unquote corn belt, we see that it significantly overlaps this historical extent of the tall grass prairie. So in thinking of the context of what might be accomplished in our prairie-derived mollisols in this corn belt, relying on regional data like that from WIXT, as opposed to data that's taken from California or New York or Michigan, might provide kind of more of a realistic understanding of what is and is not possible in this part of the world. So just to kind of wrap up here so that we can ask some questions and I don't go over time, southern Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, the part of the world that I live in and work in is predominantly mollisols, these prairie-derived soils that we're farming, and building carbon on those soils is difficult simply because of the historical vegetation. Historical vegetation that greened up early, stayed alive late into the fall, had extensive, deep rooting structures and systems, formed symbiotic relationships with fungi and bacteria that just increased the amount of carbon that made its way into the soil. And so kind of going from a system like that was in place to 2,000 or 3,000 years and moving to a corn, soy, wheat system, or even a corn alfalfa system, it's a hard kind of challenge to match the below ground productivity of those prairie systems. There are things that we can do, increasing the amount of living cover, reducing the amount of tillage, trying to integrate livestock. We talked about diversity earlier. Many of these things actually are encompassed in perennial systems. So if we can push our agricultural management or our landscapes more towards perennials, whether it's perennial forages like alfalfa or grass lays, or even kind of permanent perennial systems like rotationally grazed pasture, those are going to kind of combine multiple mechanisms to build carbon in systems and are likely to have a bigger long-term impact. I think it's really important that we have realistic expectations about carbon accrual. Carbon changes slowly. So we're talking 0.5 metric ton per carbon per hectare per year, plus or minus, is reasonable. It took the prairies a couple thousand years to get to the place we found them. And it's going to take a long time to return our agricultural soils to a place of long-term carbon accrual. When we think about the carbon markets that are coming online, it's super important that we are validating the kind of estimates or predictions that are being made early on in those carbon markets. And the only way to do that accurately is through accurate or robust empirical methods. And then finally, carbon has become kind of a huge topic of discussion, and most of it centers around kind of carbon sequestration and climate mitigation. But all of us know that there are a million co-benefits to increasing carbon in our soil, and I really don't want to lose sight of those. We know that increasing carbon is going to improve soil health. It's going to increase aggregation, soil structure, soil aeration, water holding capacity. It's going to help clean our waters as they percolate down through the soil. It's going to help reduce erosion. The list goes on and on. So I just want to make sure that as we do continue to talk about carbon and carbon accrual and soil health, we're focusing on more than just the climate piece, and really on kind of like the long-term benefits to farmers and society at large as we build our soils back. Okay, and with that, I will stop my share and happy to take any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Greg. That was a really amazing, comprehensive, and just realistic overview. I learned a lot, and I think it's really helpful to see those numbers of like what change you can realistically expect and the different levels in the soil. So thank you for that. And I want to invite folks, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. You also are welcome to unmute yourself and ask a question. It's really up to you. And it looks like we have a couple questions already. I'm going to start with Alex's question. What is the difference between measuring soil carbon and soil organic matter? That's a good question.
That's a good question, and we get it a lot. If you've taken any soil samples on your farm and sent them off to a lab to get them analyzed for phosphorus and potassium pH, you often get an organic matter measurement. It's going to be in a percent, 2.5%, 3.5%, something like that. And that is really telling you all of the parts of your soil that are not mineral. So when you think about mineral, we're talking about the clay, the silt, the sand. Those are the mineral components of your soil. The organic matter is everything else. So it includes carbon, certainly. In fact, about 50% of organic matter is carbon. So if you were trying to do a real rough calculation and you had 3% organic matter on your lab report, you could assume that you had about 1.5% carbon. So about 50% of your organic matter is carbon, but it includes other things like organic nitrogen and phosphorus that's bound up in organic matter, and the hydrogen that's associated with that organic matter. And so the way we actually estimate organic matter is pretty simple. We take a soil sample and we stick it in an oven and we just ash it. We just burn off all of the organic matter, and what we're left with is the ash, and we weigh that ash. So let's say we put in 100 grams of soil into the oven, and after sticking it in the oven for a period of time, we have 98 grams of ash left. We would say that your soil is 2% organic matter because we burned off that 2%. So it's a little bit more complicated than that, but organic matter includes a lot more than just soil carbon. But again, they're closely related.
Yeah, thanks for that clarification. And if folks want to get the carbon measured in their soil, is that something they can just send to a lab that does other soil sampling?
Right. Most soil labs that do kind of regular routine farm fertility, they give you organic matter kind of with your fertility report typically, but you can also have your soil analyzed for total carbon if you are interested in it. It tends to be more expensive. And so it's not something that a lot of people do, but if you wanted to do it, most labs can do it. Yes.
Wonderful. Another question in here, how might a farmer reliably get a sense of carbon accumulation and cycling on their farm? Well, we kind of answered that. You can test for it with the soil labs.
Well, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. I can't tell if you just answered the question or if you asked me one to answer.
I did both. I'll say it again though. How might a farmer reliably get a sense of carbon accumulation and cycling on their farm?
Sure.
But it sounds like.
Yeah, I think one of the best things you can do, like organic matter is a good start. But if you're really curious, one thing you could do is start measuring, like having a soil lab give you total carbon. But most universities recommend that you retest your soil every 3 to 5 years. If you're sticking with that, you should be able to slowly watch trends in your soil organic matter, which will give you a sense of where carbon is going. And again, this plus or minus half a metric ton of carbon per year, some years you're going to gain carbon, some years you're going to lose carbon. So it's very noisy, which is why I would not recommend sampling really regularly, but that 3 to 5 year window is pretty good. That'll give you a sense. If you really want kind of an accurate take, I would recommend reaching out to a group in your area, a university in your area, or a group in your area that's measuring carbon, and see if they could help you. You can do, between the lab and kind of some of the things you need to do in the field, the methods are relatively straightforward and you can do an accurate job, but you might need just some pointers to make sure you're collecting the pieces of data you need.
Mm-hmm. You said universities could, like, extension agents help with that too, do you think?
A lot of extension agents can help with it too. The critical piece is you need that kind of carbon measurement, and then you need a measurement of the soil mass that you sample. So it gets a little bit tricky, but I'd be happy if anybody was curious to connect them with people in their area that might be able to help them if anybody wanted to send me an email or connect with me. But yeah.
Yeah, wonderful. We can drop your email address in the chat too, Greg, so people have it. Another question here, what are the base carbon levels of the soils in Wisconsin versus Michigan that you reference, and how does this affect future sequestration other than simple soil classifications?
Right. So there's a couple things at play in terms of how we can accumulate carbon. And I think the question is getting at this. One of them is, how much carbon did the soil start off with? There's a bit of a debate right now about whether or not we can saturate our soils. If our soils can become carbon saturated, that is, accumulate to a point where they're not accumulating anymore. And you would imagine that a soil that's starting off with a lot of carbon is going to hit that saturation point quicker. So in Wisconsin, our surface soils are maybe 2.5% carbon. The total stock, kind of down to about a meter, is maybe 120 metric tons per hectare of carbon. In Michigan, their surface soils are about half what ours are. So there is room in those Michigan soils theoretically to build more because they're going to reach saturation later. But the thing that's missing there is the minerals are really important. You know, the Michigan soils are sandier, so they can accumulate carbon, but it's hard for that carbon to become stable. So for carbon to become stable, we do need clay. We need silt and clay, particles that can occlude or kind of like form around carbon, and particles that can adsorb. You know, basically they bond ionically. The carbon bonds ionically to those clay surfaces. And so it would be much easier to change the carbon in the Michigan soils because we're starting from a lower point. And just by adding plant biomass, that plant biomass is slowly decomposed and sits around and kind of can be accounted as carbon. The problem is that because so much of that soil is sandy, if there was ever a disturbance, somebody came in and tilled the field, or the climate changed significantly, a lot of that carbon could actually leave. Whereas the carbon in Wisconsin, it's harder to build because we're starting at a higher level, but we've got a lot. And I'm speaking of whole states right now. I'm speaking of these two locations, but the carbon in southern Wisconsin is in a soil that has a lot of silt and a lot of clay. And so it's much harder to move the dial because of how much carbon we're starting with. But if we can get carbon into that system, that carbon has a much better chance of sticking around for a long time. So I hope that helped answer it. It's not just kind of forest or prairie. There's also this textural layer, and that textural layer has a big impact on how long carbon can stick around in a system.
Mm-hmm. He's the person who asked the question said, "Thank you. Yes, it did."
Okay,
So
good.
wonderful. Yeah. What I hear you saying is that every soil is different and there's pluses and minuses to each one.
Yeah, and it can be maddening, you know, like what do we do? And that's where we get back to those kind of basic principles that I think, you know, are being um, encouraged everywhere. You'll hear them talked about as regenerative ag principles or soil health principles, but this like reduce tillage, increase living cover, increase biodiversity, integrate crops, livestock if you can, like anything we can do to kind of move the system towards that kind of direction where they're behaving more like perennial systems is going to be good in the long term.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what I heard you say at the end, especially, was like, this takes a long time, but there are more benefits than just storing carbon. If you change your management practices in a way that's going to store carbon, you're going to see lots of other benefits to your farm, and a lot of them economic benefits too that benefit like your farm and the community. So I appreciated you saying that, like, this is a prairies, thousands of years, and it's
Yeah,
not going to happen overnight. And I also appreciated the point you made about if you hear somebody say like 3, 5, metric
tons per acre per
tons,
year. Yeah,
yeah, like that's really unrealistic, and just check to
yeah.
your
Just
sources.
step back and ask yourself, does this make sense?
Yeah.
And I just want to, like, on the lines of what you're saying in terms of like economic profitability, like that again you know, for some people it seems to pan out really quickly. For other people it takes longer, and it can be, you know, a reason people, you know, ditch cover crops early because they're not seeing those
Mhm.
benefits. And part of that is that, you know, you're asking the soil system to provide a production benefit that's really manifests itself in hard years, you know, when
Mhm.
water is scarce, et cetera. And that's something that just takes time
Mhm.
to really pay off. So
Yeah, it's very quick and easy to till, but to repair soil takes a very long time. Do you have, I'm curious if you know of any like case studies of farmers that have changed their practices to increase carbon and have seen the other benefits? Have you worked with any individual farms
I
that
mean,
you know of?
we've worked with a lot of individual farmers. We work with a lot of individual farmers now who anecdotally
Mm,
really do believe in the practices they're doing and have seen change. And, that's so exciting on a number of levels, in particular, if it like keeps them kind of asking questions and moving in that direction. We have a project right now that's called SOCNet, the Soil Organic Carbon Network, which is funded through SARE, and it basically links long-term ag research experiments in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Iowa to a network of on-farm sites in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Iowa, where we have farmers that are doing change in practice, and we've committed to long-term, like
mm.
decadal sampling and analysis of carbon and the impact of those things.
That's a good point for funders too. If there's any funders on the call, fund projects for more than 3 years because it takes so long to collect data and to see change. We try to say that as much as possible. It's like when you're collecting soil, when you're collecting this data, it takes many, many years to really see a change.
Yeah,
Um, so
yeah.
yeah, it's also a really good point. Another question we have here is, do you think that the carbon markets accurately take into account the natural carbon levels of soils, or are they assuming a practice leads to a certain amount of sequestration?
Mhm. I think that's a yes and type of question. That there's a lot of diversity right now in kind of the proposed protocols that different carbon markets intend to use. Almost every carbon market, I'm sure that you all have heard this, almost every carbon market coming online insists on additionality. That is, proof that you are going to change a practice. And then they have a database where they make an assumption about what that change in practice is going to do to your carbon. You're going to implement cover crops, it's going to do XYZ. You're going to go no-till, it's going to do XYZ. And it's going to, do XYZ for so many years. And I think most of them do take into account on some rudimentary level kind of where you are in the country and what your soil and climate is. But there's a big difference between how people are going about that. Like some carbon crediting efforts are using empirical data as baseline measurements. So they're actually going out to farms and collecting some initial assessment of carbon and then kind of combining their estimates and model output with those kind of empirical numbers so that they can validate. Others are relying much more on just kind of book values, and those are much, in my mind, much more problematic ways to go about these markets simply because of the variability without empiricism or some way to validate that the practices you're doing on your farm and your soils are actually doing what you think you're doing. We end up kind of defrauding ourselves and the public if we think we're sequestering carbon and we're not, but we're ultimately, like putting farmers at risk of, society kind of turning around and saying, well, why didn't you do this for us? We thought this was happening. And so I guess that's kind of like not an answer, but the way that I have understood and the market protocols that I've read is that yes, some of them are indeed doing a pretty robust job of taking into account kind of like where your soil starts and then periodically checking to see if it's going in the right direction. And others are far less robust.
Mm-hmm.
There are efforts at the federal level to get involved and have federal standards, and I think those are developing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So just double check your information, it sounds like, if you get approached or want to approach one of those organizations. Speaking of future, I'm just curious, Gregg, what the future of soil carbon management looks like in your opinion. Is there going to be, do you see like emerging trends or technologies that could kind of advance this field, or do you any like have you seen anything come up, or what do you have any encouraging outlooks?
Well, I mean, I think, projects like the Pasture Project that the Wallace Center is doing, there are a lot of encouraging things, Grassland 2.0, the work the Wallace Center is doing, the Savannah Institute here in Wisconsin trying to bring agroforestry. I mean,
Yep.
just the fact that cover crops have become like a coffee table
Mm-hmm.
discussion topic, or, we talk about it at the VFW or the barber or whatever, like that's a big deal. It's bringing, in my mind, these practices that we've known and used for really since the dawn of civilization 12,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent. Like people understood there are things we have to do to maintain the productivity of our soils, and we forgot about them, not forgot about them, but kind of cast them aside after World War II, when kind of synthetic nitrogen and mined phosphates became readily available. And I think we're returning to them. And that in my mind is super promising. Just that farmers kind of all over the place are talking about these things as if they're not kind of common sense. They've become normalized again. So that's important. I think from a technological standpoint, people will continue to push the envelope to see what things like biochar might do. You know, if biochar is a kind of output of energy generation, could we then use that biochar to sequester carbon? I think as we learn more about, from a scientific standpoint, the mechanisms underpinning carbon accrual, and that has to do a lot with the microbial populations and soil microbiomes, it's likely that those will unlock technological advances that can help us. But I think just in general, efforts that are moving us towards more perennials on the landscape, or management that's more perennial like, is going to move us in the right direction.
Yeah,
and
I think that's.
I think we just have to understand that, like, there are all these co-benefits. We need to be working for these co-benefits. The climate is changing at the same time we're trying to implement these things. And so there's just a lot of unknown. We know the things we can do to move in the direction that we need to be moving. It's just not entirely clear, like, where we're going to end up, because the climate is kind of simultaneously throwing us curveballs right and left.
Yeah, it sure does not stop. And I think that, the co-benefits and remembering to look back, like, right, cover crops was like such a niche thing not that long ago. And now it's like most farmers at least know what it is, how to talk about it. And a lot of farmers are like experimenting with it, which is really positive, and moving in the right direction. And so I think, yeah, it's important to remember how far we've come, even though we still have a long ways to go, but we are making progress. So I really appreciate kind of ending on that note. I also put in my contact information, my colleague Jane at Wallace Center, and Gregg's email address as well. Feel free to reach out to any of us about this topic today. If you have other ideas for webinars, we'd love to hear those. Like I said, there is a survey that's going to pop up after this webinar. If you don't mind filling it out for us, it really helps us develop future webinars. And I want to thank you again, Gregg, for sharing this with us today. It was such good information. It's a topic that a lot of people, I think, have questions about, and you hear a lot about in the news. So it's really great to just like hear the facts. And so
Yeah,
thank you.
My pleasure. This is great. Happy to chat with anybody if they want to reach out.
Awesome. Wonderful. And thank you all for spending your time with us here today. Like I said, we will post this to our YouTube channel after we do some editing of it, and the slides as well. You'll receive those from today. So thank you all, and have a great rest of your day.